Welcome to the Ryan Mack Show. This is my first time live on video. You can see me on YouTube, Facebook Live. Head over there. You can comment and chat today. I've got a very special guest to bring to you. He is a retired chief judge and in the Federal Trade Commission. He's a Distinguished Service Award by President George W. Bush for his service to the nation's judiciary. And he's now an author, a political fiction author. He's got 3 books, and he's here to talk with me today, retired Judge Stephen McGuire. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm doing fine, Ryan. Hope everything is going well out in Chicago. It's not too cold up there.
Yeah, Central Illinois, a little bit further from Chicago, but you know what? It's all the same. It runs the whole state here. So thanks for reaching out, coming on today and talking a little bit and chatting. So I want to talk to you about your books, and I wanted to talk to you about your experience in general. And that's kind of where we'll go, and we'll go from there. So what inspired you in writing these books?
Well, I've been interested in my writing basically all my life, I guess. I think my first real involvement in writing started in high school. I had a really great 10th grade English teacher who I think I didn't fully appreciate at the time, but gave me what I think is an outstanding foundation in English grammar. And I had a bit of a stammer when I was a kid. So I found that when I could put my thoughts to pen and paper, I could say things that I couldn't say perhaps as effectively when I was speaking. So I found it gave me great freedom to express myself on paper. This is obviously before computers. And so it sort of empowered me to say whatever I wanted to say and however I the wish to say it. And so during my college career and law school, where the writing was such an integral part of my studies, I found it to be very helpful and productive, and it has served me all my career. So I think my interest in being a writer has been there for a long, long time. I was busy in my career, so I waited until I was retired to start to write my novels.
Right.
And so it's sort of something, it's just a hobby that I've undertaken, and I've enjoyed it very much.
Awesome. So your career background, you've obviously been a chief judge, and you've done a lot of law work in your background. Has that inspired you in your book writing? Have you used that experience? Because I know your books are political fiction. So can you tell me about each of your books, just briefly about them, and then we can go into how you've related them?
Sure. I was in Washington, D.C. for 32 years. For 15 of those years, I was an appellate attorney. I was appointed as an administrative law judge with the EPA in Washington for 7, and then in 2003, I was appointed as chief judge at the Federal Trade Commission, where I presided over some really huge antitrust cases. As a matter of fact, that same year I was appointed, I presided over what was then and probably still today the largest antitrust case in FTC history. So my whole experience in Washington has been at the highest levels of government, and I've had a inside seat to see how power operates in Washington, and that's the sub theme of my books. Is how power typically is exercised in Washington. So with that in mind, I wrote my first book called Prior the Restraint. I actually began writing it several years ago, I think in response to the so-called war on terror. And the Prior Restraint is about terrorism in the I think, media, and begins when the nation's number one TV news anchorman is brutally murdered in the streets of Washington, and that instantly sent the media into a panic. But before they can make anything of it, a few days later in Manhattan, one of the country's leading newspaper columnists and her editor are also brutally murdered, seemingly by foreign, terrorists. So, seemingly overnight, a wave of censorship gripped the airwaves and the broadcasting industry for fear that if anyone said anything controversial, they might be next. So, behind the scenes was a corrupt U.S. senator who was chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, which was charged with investigating these murders. And he was intoxicated by ambition and greed, and he used the chaos of all this to advance his own agenda. And I guess you could say the protagonist was a young female, the reporter in Washington, who started to connect these two murders and started to see things no one else could see. And as she gets closer to the truth, it places her own life in great jeopardy. So, prior restraint is a chilling story about the then restraint on free speech and the greed and power of Washington that blurs the reality between fantasy and what's going on in Washington today. So that was my first effort, and then in May of 2022, I published my second book called Fractured Power, which was I call a dark and haunting, psychological, thriller about Aidan Fletcher, who is a brilliant young man who comes from very humble origins and uses his extraordinary ambition and his devious ingenuity to reach the pinnacle of power in Washington. So he brings a very dark past into Washington, and it's a chilling tale about the depths of the human psyche and the race to apprehend a serial killer whose callous disregard for all but himself create a disturbing puzzle for both law enforcement and his victims. And finally, I just issued about 2 weeks ago my third book called Secret and Deceit, which is a political thriller about money and power and the plot to assassinate the U.S. president by a cabal of unscrupulous corporate titans who fear that the president's popular the legislative agenda would cost their industry billions of dollars in commercial profits. So the protagonist there is a young Secret Service agent who was on the White House protective detail, who conducts his own behind-the-scenes investigation after the president was killed, and ascertains the dark and appalling truth behind his assassination. So in doing so, he puts his life in grave danger as the conspirators take every step to hide their identity. So those are the three books that I've published to date. And as I say, they all share the same thing about the underlying exercise of power in Washington.
Those are books. I don't read a lot, but those are books I think I would be able to sit down and read entirely from cover to cover, just because of my interest in the political atmosphere going on right now. So it's hard to sit there and listen to it and think it's a political fiction novel because of some of the things that have happened in DC over the last 50 some odd years.
Right.
So obviously your career and your background and your experience in DC kind of helped influence you in your writing. So how realistic are these fictional novels that you've written, just based on everything that's going on?
That's a great question. I've been asked several times. I've probably made about 50 presentations about my books in the last 18 months or so, and I've appeared on a dozen or so podcasts and nationally syndicated radio interviews. And I've been asked uh, uh, the more than once, are your stories fiction or are they true? And I say, well, they're fiction, but they could be true. And I think what we're seeing today in Washington, both on the Hill and elsewhere, is creating a chaotic scenario for everyone. And at this point, it seems like we're somewhat in uncharted territory than politically. And I think it's incumbent on the people of this country to stand up and be heard. And I think in part that's why um, things are evolving the way they are, because the public um, is not involved in the process. So it's something of concern, I think, to everyone.
Yeah, you spoke to the public awareness, because there's so many. You look at the news headlines, and you see every day there's a new headline, either mass shooting, or Congress is at a stalemate for their bills and laws going on. Um, so, current event wise, do you see any of these things? And we've already had political assassinations before. Do you see anything like that happening again to that level?
Well, I think we're in it's, like I said, uncharted territory here. I think, frankly, anything's possible. I certainly hope that's not in the cards, but I
Yeah.
don't know. I think the stakes at this point have become so great that you can't you can't underestimate um, what could happen here. And So all the more reason, I always cite in my uh, conferences a survey taken not long ago by the Annenberg Public Policy Institute, and it said only one American in four can even name the three branches of government.
Sad.
So when you have a public that ill-informed, is it any wonder why things are in such bad shape in Washington?
Well,
So
and
it's
they
incumbent.
hear the headlines, and they see the headlines, they blindly follow whatever media site they follow, and that's it. And then they don't get the other side at all, and that's where you have the tension and division. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about your insight on one of your books. Now, forgive me, I'm still learning titles. It's the one where you portray the corrupt senator that represents um, the perception of the current congressmen and senators. So, how do you think that portrayal of the corrupt senator represents the current public perception in Congress?
I think if I could be humble, I think that's pretty much what people perceive to be the case. And for those of your audience that have ever watched the show House of Cards with Kevin Spacey, it portrays politics on Capitol Hill in a somewhat jaded light, and that's how I portray them. And I always talk about politics on the Capitol Hill as all about money and power. The issues that are tossed back and forth are just pawns in the overall scheme of things. And it's just a big chessboard, and the lobbyists, the special interests, and the politicians exchange the issues for money and power, and that's all it's really about. And the real art of politics, you've heard that expression, is, in my view, the politicians. And like I said to you before the show, my books are very the nonpartisan. What I write about is applies equally to both sides. But the real art of politics are the politicians going to their constituents and trying to convince them that they're working on their behalf, when in reality they're working on behalf of their corporate and sponsors. And many of these same sponsors contribute to both sides of the aisle. So it's almost like I think, diversion when people tune in to CNN or Fox. It doesn't matter, and they're arguing whatever it is they're arguing, while behind the scenes in Washington, the politicians are actually working together to serve interests that are not necessarily good for the country.
Right. Yeah. Like I said, reading, just hearing you describe the characters and the overall plots in your books, it's hard not to picture what's actually taking place in Washington today. So with that, your characters, obviously, they seem very real. So
Right.
how did you develop your characters in the process?
Well, that's a good question, and it's something that I put the most time in on my books. I like to develop the characters to make them real. And in my first book, The Prior Restraint, I think I took four of the major characters back into their childhoods. So the readers would know not only who they are, but why they are the way they are. And a lot of these characters are not good people necessarily, but you understand them. You're inside their head as a reader, and it's almost like as the author too. I'm in the same room as they are, and I'm just allowing them to carry the storyline because I know them so well. And I saw an interview once with James and Patterson, who said he doesn't start on a book until he pretty much knows how it's going to end. And I'm not quite like that. I have an idea how I want the story to go, but I like to think that the characters carry the plot line, and just getting into their heads and being part of them. I think about how would they react under these circumstances, and I allow those reactions to carry the story. So I think that's what make my books uh, of interest to quite a few people, is that the characters are unlike many characters you'll read in other novels, and something I take great pride in.
That's awesome. Um, I cannot honestly wait to grab all three of them and read them. They're right up my alley. So with your career going as long as it did, and you just started getting into writing after you retired,
Right.
can you describe your writing process for being a first time author? Because obviously you had the drive to write, but where did you start, and how did you develop um, that process?
Well, that's another good question. I like I say, I always had the interest in other writing, and I had writers that I always sort of looked up to. A couple of them were John Krakauer, who wrote Into Thin Air about the 1997 uh, uh, expedition to Mount Everest that ended with seven of the climbers being killed. And he was on that expedition, and the way he described being on the side of that mountain when this major snowstorm blew up, and he put you on that mountain. And so I really liked how he wrote. And I think another author that I followed and was somewhat inspired by is Daniel Silva, who, as you may know, has written 25 novels. And even though most of them involve the same character who's a Israeli spy, there was one scene in a book of his, I think it's Portrait of a Spy, where he's uh, in Paris, where I've been to several times, and he's on this old side street with this antique store, and he happened to mention in the scene that there's this big crack above the frame of the door leading into the antique store. And at that moment, I knew he had stood right in front of that antique store.
Mm-hmm.
And by putting in that level of detail, it transported me as the reader to that scene. And I think that's one of the greatest things you can ever say about a writer is that they're able to take you from your uh, uh, the lazy boy chair wherever you're reading
Mm-hmm.
to the scene that's being described. So
Yeah.
these were some individuals that influenced me, and but I being in Washington as long as I was and experiencing what I experienced, that was the source of most of my knowledge. And I started in Washington when I was 25 years old. So I kind of grew up as an adult in Washington. So this was the foundation for my experience. So that's what came to me, I think, naturally. And um, I like to describe things the way they are. So, like I said, as in House of Cards, my books have somewhat of a jaded view toward the process on Capitol Hill.
Right.
So um, I think the kicker, and I like to tell this story. My the wife and I were in Key West a few years ago, and we were having lunch at the Sloppy Joe's restaurant, which some of your viewers may know was where Ernest Hemingway used to spend a
Hmm.
lot of time. And so right on the wall was a real large photo of Hemingway, and our table was right in front of it. And I started staring at this photo, and I saw that he was, staring back at me. And so our eyes, kind of locked for a long, uh, 20 seconds. And it occurred to me at that moment, I had an epiphany that Hemingway wants me to write. So that was sort of my final inspiration, and that's what I did. So I wrote about those things that I understood, the most, and I tried to give my stories a real, foundation.
Well, that makes it unique when you can go off of your background and then be able to write something that is realistic, but also fictional in a sense, obviously. But it makes it really peel out on the page and jump out at you when you have your background thrown into it. It's kind of neat. So, with your time in Washington, do you consider yourself to be an insider, or are you someone who clocked in and clocked out and went home and just didn't want to be a part of it?
No, 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 no. I mean, being a federal judge, you have to stay above the fray, so to speak. But I was exposed to most of the things that I talk about in the books, and you can't help at that the level of government to understand how government works, and that's why I'm saying about the citizens of the country. They need to become more involved in the process so they too can understand. And once they do, they will probably be motivated to stand up and say enough, And when the politicians believe that and the citizen are not paying attention, it sort of gives them the freedom to do whatever they wish. And typically that's not in the best interest of the people.
Right, right. Yeah, certainly seeing that a lot going on. So your novels have common themes of power, greed, and corruption. And we obviously discussed this before the show started that how real these things are as to what happens on Capitol Hill. Now, with your inside scoop in Washington, and we've talked about this. Um, are these the kind of the center themes of what's going on in Washington the last, 50 years?
I don't know. I think from my perspective, I'm 72, so I've been around for a while. And when I was in Washington, I was very much caught up in the politics of the times and paid close attention to everything going on then politically. I think we've seen a complete breakdown, to be honest with you. And That's why I keep saying I think we're in uncharted waters. And um, uh, I know there are some, I think, good people out there that are trying to get our system back up and running the way it should. But, think back when Bill Clinton was president, we had a balanced budget in this country. The last presidential budget for this year, I think, came in at $1.8 trillion.
Yeah, an ungodly number. Yeah.
And it's only getting, and so what happened? What happened in those 20 short years that we would go from having a Congress and a president who worked together to balance the federal budget to where now it's just out of control. So I don't know. I again until the and I think the public in several ways has been somewhat dumbed down. I mean, when I was in high school, one of the best classes I ever had was in civics, where you were taught about your government, how laws are made, and if you were fortunate, your class may even take a field trip to Washington and
Yeah.
go to Capitol Hill and go to the Supreme Court, and it's where you could learn about not only what your rights were as a citizen, but what your obligations were. And you don't see that much anymore. And so, as a consequence, there's such a large percentage of the population that just completely uninformed. And when you're uninformed, you're not inclined to want to stand up and say no.
Right, and participate in any way. Yeah. So, with that, I know that I had some college classes when I was at a local university here, some histories, maybe some world history, but it wasn't like an entire year's worth. It was broken down a semester as far as going through it. And at the high school level, I went to a small high school, so I had my favorite courses were U.S. history and history, and I was just fascinated with how government worked and how what our history showed us. Um, and it's amazing, like we spoke earlier, that the level of the lack of competency among some of the youth, that they have no idea how our government works or how it should work. And even to an extent our politicians don't, because you see them making laws that are completely obliterating the Constitution and how it was written. So I would like to. I know we're gonna plug your book. It's your books and your website. I think I got this website up on the comments section there. But I want to speak more about your time in Washington as a judge, and maybe you can give your insight and your opinions on some of the headlines going around. Now I know we're in different states, but you being a chief judge, about the basic level of constitutionality of some of these cases.
Well,
What decides constitutionality of a law being written, and then how is it from your perspective? How do you see it as a judge? Maybe you can kind of describe that.
as I told you before the show started, I intentionally have not kept abreast of a lot of the national issues because I've become somewhat jaded as to how the process works. And again, I'm not confident that the media in generally is getting out a fair message to a lot of the public. So as these cases arise, one in particular is the January 6th an insurrection, as it was called.
Yeah.
Um, I'm very concerned about how those cases have been, founded and formulated. Not to say that some of those participants did not break the law, but
Right.
and should be held accountable. But I was impressed at the time when almost immediately and overnight this event in Washington was not described as a protest or as a riot, but immediately by almost all the TV and news channels as an insurrection,
Yeah.
which is a term invoking in treason.
Yeah.
And I've
Yeah.
never seen that done before. And so, again, the narrative shapes public opinion to an extraordinary degree. So that's one ongoing case that is of concern to me and should be to most people.
Yeah. So we can just talk about not these specific cases that we mentioned earlier, but just on a broad level. When it comes to the Second Amendment, what do you look for as constitutionality of some of these laws that go into play?
You mean in terms of
banning certain firearms that have commonly been
yeah,
used
yeah.
for
Well,
where.
I believe in I clearly and strongly believe in the right to bear arms. Um, I sometimes wonder, though, as a pragmatist and as a moderate, um, do some of these automatic weapons need to be in possession of individuals? And I could entertain an argument that probably not. These are assault weapons used, for war. And so I don't know. But I'm afraid if there was ever an effort to restrict access to those kinds of weapons, that it would merely open the door to the banning of other firearms, which I think would be clearly wrong.
Right.
So these are not easy questions. It's not all black and white. And as I think, moderate in the equation, I can see some arguments on both sides on the assault weapon thing. But in terms of having the ability under the Constitution to bear arms, I think that should not be infringed.
Right. So I want to push back a little bit because I know you have more experience in some of these cases and legal matters with them. But is there, besides a legal term, I don't even know it's a legal term, assault weapon, what have you seen the media push these as other than what they are, semi-automatic rifles that are the most commonly used rifle? I mean, I have a couple of them
Yes,
currently.
correct.
But what have you seen? Maybe you haven't seen it because, like you said, you've stayed out of it for the most part of the major headlines. How hard is it to get to the actual issue of, okay, mental health versus safety with the firearms, and picking apart what the media calls it, assault weapon? They blanded a term and they have
Right.
no idea what they're talking about.
No, well, it's the shaping of the narrative. The narrative defines the issue for the great majority of people. And thank you for your clarification, even for me. I mean, I've got 3 or 4 guns myself. I don't have a semi-automatic rifle, so even I can confuse that.
Right.
I was thinking in terms of like a AK-47 or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
But
I haven't been big into it. I know I have in-laws that got me into it, and I've been an enthusiast. I'm a young shooter when it comes to shooting and sports shooting and things. So I've gotten myself somewhat acquainted to some of these guns. But uh, again, we talked about with the media narrative, these big bad assault weapons without even really knowing what they're talking about. When you have a president coming out and saying they can do certain things with the stock or the the bullet itself is more explosive than another round. That's why we need to ban them. You see right there, it's the narrative push, and more
Right.
than so than just to talk about the actual weapon. I think personally, it comes down to mental health. I think if you actually follow the red flag laws in some of these states, you
Right.
actually follow up as law enforcement and a judicial discretion into a background of an individual, that's where you can get a handle on some of these mass shootings, right? I mean,
Well, I think so.
what is your take on judicial discretion when it comes to some of these things? You know, with the last one we just had in Maine,
Right.
guy was a firearms instructor. He was well
Right.
trained, and he still was able to use an AR-15 to kill, 18, 22 people. I think it was when it ended up being.
Right.
So, is it the guns or is it the mental health the more of the problem?
Well, the old saying with the pro-gun crowd is guns don't kill, people do. So that's obviously the case. I think in our society being as complex as it is, I mean, take guns out of the equation. We don't have enough facilities and assistance for people that have mental issues to begin with.
Right.
And throwing the gun issue in is just, another layer of complexity
Yeah.
on how do we use the facilities we have to help improve individual mental health in this country when we don't even have adequate facilities to do it on a daily basis.
Right.
So the gun equation is something that I think it just is going to, unhealthy people get a hold of these guns as well. And so I don't know. I don't know how you address that. You've got to, maybe we need a better system in our schools to try to develop a healthier respect for our fellow man, to
Mhm.
where a lot of the hatred and the biases that that ground a lot of these actions are based. And I don't have the answer for that. I think we as a society have come too far now to go back and try to get a firm grip on this
Right.
national problem.
Yeah, I think it's a huge debate that continues to be a thorn in either side of the equation. Gun enthusiasts and it should say the Second Amendment shall not be infringed. I can own whatever I want. And then you have the left side of the argument. Well, no, you can't own this and you can't own that. And then there are reasonable laws that can be made. And we've seen that in some of the judicial levels say, yes, these are reasonable. And I agree with the automatic weapons. But an outright ban and even the state level that's egregiously left leaning on the court side, upholding some of these bans, constitutionality wise, how does that hold up in the Supreme Court level? Do you think if some of these statewide bans go too far?
Well, I think ultimately that's where it will go, is to the Supreme Court. I think the present court, as constituted, would probably strike many of those bans down. But again, you don't know what the bans hold in particular. So it's all comes down to the law
Right.
and the facts. What are the facts of the ban that have invoked this constitutional challenge? So until you get those two issues on the same page, so the Supreme Court justices can weigh against established law what the facts of the ban invoke. It's difficult to predict, but hopefully down the line there will be a overriding voice of a reason that takes into account maybe quite a few of these issues.
Yeah, I
But
think we've seen that. I'm sorry, in some of the state levels, we've seen some of the left leaning states, we've seen like a hijacking of the legal system to
right,
just rewrite the laws and precedents that are on the books and decide, well, I'm going to make it this own way because this is how I feel it should be
right.
judged and discussed. How does that? So, I guess going back to your process as a judge, when you have a case in front of you and you obviously you're human, so you're going to feel one way or another on the opinion, but you have to be right down the middle on terms of what the law is bringing a challenge to, right?
Well, let me tell you how I interpreted my role as a federal judge. I disagree that you bring your own personal feelings into the equation. The only two things that really matter when a case is before a judge are the ultimate facts that are established during the proceeding, like both parties to a case will have proposed facts that they want the court
Hmm.
to adopt, but
Right.
it's up to the court to establish what we call the ultimate facts of the case. And once you've done that, you've gone through that exercise, and sometimes that's not easy,
Right.
then you apply the existing law. Your
Right.
personal opinion should have nothing to do with it. If judges applied their personal view on cases, then we would have so many different layers of justice, however you want to define it, that
Hmm.
it would be obfuscating, a standard by which the country, or in this case of the state, I think the states you're talking about are basically invoking I think, totalitarian rule of law, which is obviously we've seen in other countries in the world how that turns out.
Right.
But as far as the judges go that decide these things, in my view, there's only been a couple of cases in my career that the call was so close that I invoked somewhat of a personal view of the world to decide the case. But I very rarely ever did that because I felt my job was to determine the facts and apply the law. And oftentimes the law is not clear either. So, but you have to go on case precedent,
Hmm.
and um, on occasion there'll be case that invokes an expansion of the existing law, and that's part of the equation. But I never tried to invoke my personal views.
That's important. I want to touch on that because there have been judicial reviews and cases ruled on in some of these decisions at the federal level that you've seen activist level judges
Yes.
deciding these cases that have zero precedent in some of these cases. And
Right.
what does that make you feel as someone who has spent their entire career as a judge?
Well, I think in a lot of these state court systems, I think it's more profoundly invoked in the state courts, but these judges are oftentimes appointed, if not elected,
Right.
based on their political supporters. And with that in mind, they know which side their bread is buttered on, and so to some extent, these court systems have become then politicized, and that's not to say that doesn't happen to some extent in the federal court
Right.
system as well, and it does. But again, um, I never saw my response. I always felt I held the public trust. And I always felt if we couldn't trust our judges to do the right thing based on fact and law, then our society would have no hope.
Yeah.
And so, to the extent that some of these court systems have become overly uh, then politicized, is not is not a good thing for the country itself. And again, it's going to be the responsibility of people in those states where these progressive gun bans are showing
Hmm.
up to stand up
Right.
and say no. And but I fear with the lack of education in both our school systems and even in the public airwaves uh, on 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 these issues, uh, people don't know what's happening, nor do they care in many regards. So
Yeah.
it's a
Um,
difficult conversation.
right. So I want to highlight a federal case that was handed down, I think, well, just last summer, I think, or at least before that, the big one on the books that was handed down, Roe v. Wade. Now, leftists have been blowing their minds and blowing their lids off over that decision because they felt it was a constitutionally protected right to access to abortion. Now, I'm not a constitutional scholar. Several that I've talked to have said that if it's not written explicitly in the Constitution, it goes back to the states, right? As far as powers to legislate.
Right.
So, in your opinion, was that law thrown back to the states correctly by SCOTUS?
Yes, I think it was, because many of the constitutional scholars, and I'm certainly not one of them, have said when the court decided Roe v. Wade back, when was that?
I think last June.
No, I'm talking about when they first.
Oh, gosh,
I mean, that's been a generation ago.
Yeah, at least.
But many of the constitutional scholars have said that was an incorrect application of constitutional law to have upheld it the way they did. And so when that was reversed last year, now all the folks who feel that they had a constitutional right to an abortion were offended that that decision came down the way it had. But on purely a constitutional framework, that was the correct decision, and it should be up to the states to determine whether one has the right to an abortion. And that's not my opinion. That's just that's the legality of the constitutional framework.
Well, and I think that's something that we're missing currently at our level of deciding these cases, and even just running the government as a general. We're not following the document that founded this country. And I think this was the biggest case that supported that. And like all the justices are not, they followed the facts of the Constitution. If it was written in the Constitution, it will be applied. If it was not, it needs to be brought back to the states to decide.
And not only that, that is the ultimate truth. But not only that, but the original Roe v. Wade decision was based on extra constitutional grounds. It wasn't even decided in a constitutional framework.
Right.
So many of the constitutional historians have always felt that the first Roe v. Wade decision was improperly decided, because it was they created this right in a judicial opinion that did not exist within the construct of the Constitution. So purely legally speaking, and that's all I'm saying, it was the correct decision last year to overturn that.
That's my wife chiming in there. She's chiming in with some comments. And you're right. The case should be made based on fact versus emotion, and that's how judges should be operating, as you have said earlier. So, at the federal level, with that, after Roe v. Wade was passed and handed down as a decision, you had the Biden administration, the DOJ, weaponized and go after states that enforced a more restrictive measure. Now, after a case has been handed down from the Supreme Court, and that's redetermined as, okay, this is how it is, how can the DOJ go back and sue the states for something that they've been granted they were allowed to do?
Well, they can do anything they want. The question is, will that action ultimately be upheld? And again, it comes down to the facts and the law of what happened. You're discussing a generic thought about how the DOJ might take action.
Right. So again, well, specific, I think specifically, I don't know how many states, proposed. I'm certain more conservative states enacted their restrictive measures, and some progressive ones opened the door. Right. I just was dumbfounded by the fact that, when a decision is made, yes, you can sue, but I don't know. I think a few of them have been upheld, and some of them maybe have been struck down at the federal district level, but I just was speaking to an opinion level, just like how to fathom that. Look, okay, you told the states they can do this, and then the government comes down the executive branch saying, nope, you can't, it's too restrictive. But here's the decision, the Supreme Court level saying, yes, states have the authority to make their own
Well,
case.
again, you have to go back to each and every state law that's been enacted in response to the Roe v. Wade decision. And there might be aspects as to how those laws were enacted that may be, invalid. I don't know the details of these state laws. You can't just make generic statements that because a state made a law to ban an abortion that the Supreme Court, every case has got to be decided on its own merits. So I think I know what you're saying, and that is, how can the DOJ come back and say you can't do this? Well, that again is a new legal issue in and of itself. It's got to be litigated on the merits of that particular law.
Right.
And until those facts are exposed and brought out and argued, we can't make a prediction on what would happen. On its face, it seems to be an illogical action by the Justice Department.
Right.
But we have to decide these things on their own merits.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that. I just wanted to get an opinion because it seems kind of silly when a case gets handed down a decision and then the DOJ immediately sues, even though that was the decision that was handed based on each individual state laws regarding that. They can do within those laws what they enacted. And I thought it was funny that the DOJ right away after Roe v. Wade was handled just started hammering conservative states.
Well, we certainly can't discount the notion that politics is the politics of these situations is out of bounds.
Right.
So that's another factor that's going to have to ultimately be weighed.
Right. Okay. So I want to get back to your process as a writer here before we start wrapping things up. So what has been the most challenging aspect for you as a writer?
Well, that's a good question. I think what I have learned in the publishing world is that so much of the books being published these days are self-published. Like my books are all on Amazon, and the traditional publishers are sort of fading away. I mean, you might be surprised to learn there are like 33 million book titles on Amazon. Now that's an extraordinary number of books. So I think the fallacy for many first-time authors is that they take great pride in their work, and they think if it can only get out there and expose that it'll make the New York Times bestseller list and become a Hollywood movie, and they're going to get wealthy, and I'll go on and on. But nothing can be further from the truth. There was a survey taken by a major publishing firm that said 70% of the books that are published don't even turn a profit. So the idea that you're going to write a couple of books and make a lot of money is sort of a fantasy. And that happens to a few authors, but not to the great majority. I write for the fun of it. Because I enjoy writing, and it's something inside me that I like to get out. But I don't know. I think I like to create unique storylines, and I think the hardest part as a author in coming up with a new book is creating that storyline that hasn't been done before. In my second book, Fractured Power, that plot line is unique. It's never been done before, and that's what makes the story unique. So it's the hardest part, is to come up with that kind of a story. And then once I do, creating the characters and making them real just kind of comes easy to me.
That's awesome. It certainly would not come easy to me. I've always had the idea of wanting to write. I thought maybe writing a sarcastic level kids book, like you see some of the political humor books out there.
Yeah.
I have a few funny lines on the take of if you give a mouse a cookie, but I don't know how to twist it into a longhand form at the moment. But yeah, I couldn't imagine the challenging aspect for you as a writer, coming up with a unique idea that may or may not, like you said, make you a millionaire overnight, but something you love to do. And
Right.
just doing it as you love is something that may even create a window down the road. If you stick
Well,
to
it
that
might.
philosophy of doing something you love, who
Right.
cares about doing it for a lot of money?
Right. Well,
Um,
I have to interject and give credit to my wife, who was a former special agent in Washington, and now she's become my book agent,
yeah,
and she's done a really extraordinary job of getting me on these shows and uh, public radio broadcasts, and so if it works out, I do think my books would make extraordinarily good movies if it
mhm,
ever came to that. But I don't need the money. I do it for fun, and if something positive comes of it all down the road, that's great. But you know,
right.
we'll see.
Yeah. So you mentioned something earlier that you're self-published. I know another conservative radio host, Dan Bongino. You probably know who he is.
Yes.
He owns a publishing company. With the advent of politics and all these companies that are doing things now, how important is it to you to self-publish versus, hey, depending on another company who may or may not believe of some of your beliefs?
Well, I think it's not so much how important it is to self-publish, but it's the ease of getting published, and that's been the great eye-opening thing for me. With these traditional publishers, they're getting inundated with manuscripts from either aspiring authors, or maybe if those authors have an agent, and they're just going straight into the trash can because they're just inundated with these book ideas. And um, on a self-publishing platform such as Amazon, and there are several others, you can get published. They'll help you with their Kindle publishing arm, design the book cover, give you an ISBN number, um, or to format the book, and so it's the ease of the process that I think is what makes self-publishing now the dominant publishing platform in the industry.
Right.
So, um, I with the traditional publishers, even if you were to sign a book deal, it might be 2 years before your book's really published.
Right.
And at that point, they own the book. If they don't like how you wrote chapter 5, you've got
Mhm.
to do it again and
Right.
rewrite it. And so it's about control. It's about a lot of things. And one of the things I learned about the traditional publishers is that they don't market the book as to the extent people may think. So what they're really looking for these days is not authors, but audiences. If you don't have a couple of thousand people on your Facebook or Twitter
Mhm.
following you, it
Right.
doesn't matter what your book is about.
Yeah.
They want to have an instant audience
Right.
that they can market these books for. So
Yeah.
that's one of the things I've learned. And so the self publishing route is easier, though, when you're on competing with 33 million other book titles, that makes it a little hard to stand out.
Yeah. I can imagine. Okay, so do you have your idea for your next book then?
I do.
Okay. And what
And
is your next book?
well, I can't say too much about it, but
Okay.
I think it's going to involve the confiscation of family farms in like Iowa, and by oppressive government regulations, and the act of one particular farmer who lost his son in a, I think, Ruby Ridge type of incident,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll see. And there's a lot of issues going on now with the food supply in this country, and uh, with millions of prime farmland acres being purchased. So it's something that I'm giving thought to.
Absolutely. That's going to be a great book because I know I've read stories about that already around the country with the
Right,
China's having an influence, Bill Gates having his influence,
right.
buying up private property. I
That's
may
right.
just have you on at some point when you finish that book and talk about that one by itself. Well, that's gonna be a whole
Right.
topic by itself.
Well, and as we talked earlier before the show about in the Chicago area, there's now a movement to have government controlled grocery stores. So
Yeah.
that's not,
Yeah.
all that ties into that overall
Yeah.
story.
Well, and that can tie into everything else going on with that government owned and the
Right.
ESG level and things like that. We can get into another discussions all day long,
Yeah.
right? Thank you so much for coming on. Real quick, where can they get your books? I know
You,
I put it the comment section with the your website. Where else can they get your books?
well, they can get it on, go on Amazon Books and either type in my name, Stephen, then McGuire, or you can go on my website, StephenMcGuireAuthor.com. It's Stephen with a PHEN. And that'll describe all of my books. It'll give a background on my own biography. And so Amazon is the chief market for my books. And you can leave comments on my website. And we've had a good response. And I think if you were to go on that website, you'd find out a whole lot more about myself and about these book lines. So I would encourage your viewers to take a
Yeah,
minute and take
absolutely.
a look.
I will be grabbing them and I will absolutely advertise them too on my show going forward.
Thank you. Thank
Thank you so much again for reaching out and coming on. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. We
you.
hope to
Okay,
do more.
Ryan, I've enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, we
And
will
good
do
luck.
we'll do some more in the future too.
Good enough. We'll stay in
Yeah.
touch.
All right. Thank you.